It started with the kind of story that spreads in whispers, the kind that grows legs and walks around in the dark corners of small towns. People said a bridge appeared at midnight deep in the woods, a bridge that didn't exist on any map. Those who saw it claimed it wasn't made of wood or stone, but something darker, something slick and unnatural. If you crossed it, you wouldn't come back, at least not all of you. For Ellie and her younger brother Sam, the story wasn't just a ghost tale to pass the time. It was a clue. Their middle sibling Luke had been missing for 6 months. One day he'd been working the night shift at the gas station. The next his car was abandoned at the edge of the forest, keys still in the ignition, like he'd just walked off into the trees. No note, no calls, just silence. Ellie was the practical one, 28 years old, with her brown hair tied in a messy bun and dark circles under her eyes that had taken up permanent residence. She'd been the one to organize search parties, combing the forest trails with flashlights and maps, calling out Luke's name until her voice cracked. Sam, at 21, was different, impulsive, sarcastic, and prone to biting his nails when things got tough. The youngest in the family, he'd always been in Luke's shadow, trying to keep up. But now, with Luke gone, Sam had taken it hard. Too hard. The stories about the midnight bridge came from a late-night tip in a diner. An old man with a leathery face leaned across the counter and muttered, "The bridge gets people like your brother. If you want him back, go find it. But don't say I didn't warn you." His eyes were dead serious, and Ellie had felt a chill run down her spine. They didn't tell their parents where they were going. Mom had started sleeping with the TV on, and Dad had buried himself in fixing the old Chevy in the garage. They didn't need more reasons to worry. So one cold November night, Ellie and Sam packed flashlights, snacks, and a camping knife, then headed for the forest. The woods felt alive in the way old forests sometimes do, with the kind of quiet that's not really quiet at all. The wind hissed through the branches, and leaves crackled under their boots, even though neither of them spoke much. Ellie gripped her flashlight like it was a weapon, while Sam kept glancing over his shoulder like he expected something to jump out of the darkness. As they walked deeper, the air grew colder, not the normal chill of the season, but a biting, unnatural cold that seemed to seep through their jackets and into their bones. Ellie's breath came out in frosty puffs, and Sam cursed under his breath, rubbing his gloved hands together. Midnight was coming, and with it maybe the bridge, or maybe something worse. The forest grew darker even with the full moon hovering above. Its light seemed unable to penetrate the thick canopy of trees, as if the shadows themselves were swallowing it whole. Ellie checked her phone for the time. 11:57 p.m. They were close. She could feel it, though she couldn't explain why. The air had grown heavy, pressing down on her chest with every step, and even Sam, normally quick with a joke, had gone silent. Then they saw it. At first, it was just a shimmer through the trees, like moonlight reflecting off water. But as they stepped closer, the shimmering grew more defined. The bridge didn't materialize all at once. It unfolded, piece by piece, as if it were being constructed out of the night itself. The planks were black, glossy, and smooth, with an almost liquid sheen that glimmered under the moonlight. The railings arched unnaturally, twisting like the ribcage of some long-dead creature. It stretched across a deep ravine they hadn't noticed before, its depths swallowed by shadows. The air around it hummed faintly, like the sound of distant electricity. But Ellie and Sam heard no rushing water below, just silence. "Holy shit," Sam whispered, stepping closer. He stopped abruptly, his eyes darting to Ellie. "You see that, right? Please tell me you see that." Ellie nodded, her throat too dry to speak. Her grip tightened on her flashlight, though she didn't bother shining it at the bridge. Somehow she knew the light wouldn't reach it, or if it did, it would only reveal things she didn't want to see. "Think it's safe?" Sam asked, his voice trembling despite the casual tone he tried to force. "No," Ellie said flatly. "But we're here, aren't we?" Sam hesitated, but only for a moment. "All right, let's do this." They stepped onto the bridge together. The wood, or whatever it was, surprisingly solid beneath their boots. Ellie glanced down and immediately regretted it. The planks weren't smooth at all. They were etched with strange symbols, carvings that seemed to writhe and shift when she tried to focus on them. She looked away, her stomach twisting. The further they walked, the thicker the mist became. It crept up from the ravine, curling around their legs like living tendrils, chilling their skin through their clothes. Sam muttered something about it smelling like damp earth and rusted metal, but Ellie didn't respond. She was too focused on the way the mist seemed to shift, forming shapes that dissolved as quickly as they appeared. Halfway across the bridge they heard it, a low, mournful sound, like a distant moan carried on the wind. Ellie froze, her heart hammering in her chest. "Did you hear that?" she asked. Sam nodded, his face pale. "It's probably nothing," he said, but his voice betrayed him. Ellie didn't believe him, but she didn't argue. She just kept walking, her eyes fixed on the misty world ahead. The end of the bridge was near, a dark curtain of fog waiting to swallow them whole. When they stepped off the bridge, the world felt different. The air was colder, heavier, and the forest around them was silent, too silent. No rustling leaves, no chirping insects, just the sound of their breathing and the faint hum of the bridge behind them. Ellie turned to look back, but the bridge was already gone, swallowed by the fog. "We're in it now," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "Yeah," Sam said, his eyes scanning the eerie forest ahead. "Let's find Luke and get the hell out of here." The forest beyond the bridge was nothing like the one they had left behind. The trees were massive, their twisted trunks blackened as if burned, and their gnarled branches clawed at the gray sky above. The ground beneath Ellie and Sam's boots was soft, almost spongy, and their footsteps sank slightly into it, leaving faint impressions that seemed to fade almost as soon as they moved on. "What is this place?" Sam whispered, his voice unusually hushed. Ellie shook her head, unable to find an answer. She didn't want to think about it too hard. The air was heavy with an unnatural stillness, the kind that didn't just muffle sound but seemed to consume it entirely. Even their breathing felt wrong, too loud, like an intrusion in a place that didn't want them there. They pressed on, their flashlights cutting weak beams through the dense fog. Ellie's mind raced as they walked. Her logical side, always the louder voice in her head, told her to turn back, even though the bridge was gone. But the rest of her, the part that had spent 6 months agonizing over Luke's disappearance, refused to give up. "Ellie," Sam said, stopping suddenly. She turned to him and saw the fear in his wide eyes. "What?" He pointed ahead, his hand trembling. At first Ellie didn't see anything. Then the fog shifted, and she saw it, a figure standing motionless among the trees. It was a man, or at least it had been at some point. His clothes were tattered and stained, his face pale and drawn, as if the life had been sucked out of him. He was staring at them, though his eyes were blank and unfocused, like those of a doll. "Do you think he's—" Sam trailed off, his voice shaking. Ellie swallowed hard. "Let's just keep moving." As they edged past the figure, Ellie kept her eyes on it, her muscles tensed, ready to run if it so much as twitched. But it didn't. It just stood there, staring blankly into the mist. Not long after, they came across more of them. Men, women, even children, all frozen in various poses. Some sitting, some standing, others crouched as if they'd fallen. Their faces were all the same, blank, lifeless, their eyes staring into nothing. "Are they," Sam whispered, his voice barely audible, "dead?" Ellie didn't answer. She didn't know if she could call these things dead. They were something else, something worse. The fog grew thicker as they walked, wrapping around them like a living thing. It wasn't just the cold anymore. It felt invasive, seeping into their skin, their minds. Ellie began to feel lightheaded, her thoughts muddling as if the fog was trying to pull her under. Then she heard it. A faint, familiar voice carried on the still air. "Ellie." Her heart lurched. It was Luke's voice, distant but unmistakable. "Did you hear that?" she asked, grabbing Sam's arm. He nodded, his face pale. "It's him, it's Luke." They exchanged a look, a mix of hope and fear, before turning toward the sound. "Luke," Ellie called out, her voice echoing strangely in the fog. "We're coming," the voice called again, closer now. "Ellie, Sam." The siblings quickened their pace, their fear momentarily forgotten. But as the mist swirled thicker around them, Ellie couldn't shake the nagging feeling in the back of her mind. Something was wrong. The voice grew clearer as they pressed on, pulling them deeper into the fog. Ellie's chest tightened with a mix of desperation and dread. She had spent months longing to hear her brother's voice again, But now, in this place, it felt wrong, like a melody played slightly out of tune. "Luke!" she shouted again, her voice trembling. Sam stayed close, his flashlight sweeping nervously through the mist. The voice answered, closer now. "Ellie! Sam! Help me!" The siblings broke into a jog, the soft ground sucking at their boots with each step. The fog seemed to pulse around them, almost alive, twisting their sense of direction. Ellie's flashlight beam wavered, catching glimpses of movement in the corners of her vision, shapes flitting between the trees. "Do you see that?" Sam whispered. Ellie nodded but didn't slow down. She didn't want to think about what those shapes might be, not now. All that mattered was getting to Luke. The voice led them to a clearing, where the fog thinned just enough to reveal a crude wooden signpost. The sign was old and weathered, the letters carved into its surface barely legible. "Stay out," Sam scoffed nervously. "Yeah, that's not ominous at all." Ellie ignored him, her eyes scanning the clearing. She could feel Luke's presence, she was sure of it, but he wasn't here. The fog swirled around them, thick and restless. Then something moved. At the edge of the clearing, a figure stepped out of the mist. It was a man, tall and gaunt, with pale skin stretched tight over his bones. His eyes were sunken, his lips cracked, and his clothes hung in tatters. But what struck Ellie most was his expression, hollow, devoid of emotion, like a marionette waiting for its strings to be pulled. Sam froze. "What the hell?" The man's head tilted unnaturally, his neck cracking as if it hadn't moved in years. His empty eyes locked onto Ellie, and for a moment neither of them breathed. Then he spoke. "You shouldn't be here." His voice was a rasp, dry and broken, like dead leaves crunching underfoot. "We're looking for our brother," Ellie said, her voice steadier than she felt. The man didn't respond. Instead, he stepped closer, his movements jerky, unnatural. The fog swirled around him as though it were part of him, clinging to his body like a second skin. Ellie instinctively stepped back, pulling Sam with her. "Do you know where he is?" she pressed. The man stopped a few feet away, his head cocking to the other side. He crossed, like the others. "What does that mean?" Sam demanded, his voice rising. The man's lips curled into something that might have been a smile, but it was wrong. Too wide, too sharp. "The bridge doesn't give, it takes." Ellie's stomach churned. "What did it take from you?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he reached out, his long skeletal fingers stretching toward them. Ellie yanked Sam back, her flashlight beam catching the glint of something in the man's other hand, a rusted chain dangling from his wrist. "We need to go," Ellie whispered, her voice barely audible. Sam didn't argue. Together they backed away from the man, their movements slow and deliberate. But as they turned to leave, a new voice echoed through the mist, a voice they knew too well. "Ellie, Sam, please help me." Luke's voice. Ellie's heart leapt, but the man in the clearing stiffened, his head snapping toward the sound. His lips moved, forming a single word. "Don't." But it was too late. Ellie and Sam were already running toward the voice, deeper into the mist. The fog thickened as Ellie and Sam ran toward the voice, each step dragging them deeper into the unknown. Their flashlights cast weak beams that barely pierced the swirling mist, and the ground seemed to shift beneath their feet, like a living thing trying to trip them up. "Luke!" Ellie shouted, her voice raw. "Where are you?" "Keep going," Luke's voice called back, distant but clear. "I'm here, don't stop." Sam stumbled, catching himself on a twisted tree. "Ellie, what if it's not him?" he panted. "It's him," she snapped. Though doubt gnawed at her resolve, she had to believe it was Luke. If she didn't, what was the point of all this? They reached a small clearing, where the fog thinned just enough to reveal a structure. It was a wooden cabin, sagging and warped with age. The roof was partially caved in, and the windows were dark and cracked. A faint light flickered inside, casting shadows that danced like broken puppets on the walls. Ellie hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to turn back. But then Luke's voice called again, closer now. "Ellie, Sam, help me!" Sam grabbed her arm. "Ellie, wait, what if this is a trap? That guy back there, what he said." "I don't care," Ellie said, shaking him off. "If there's a chance Luke's in there, I'm not leaving him." She pushed open the cabin door and it creaked loudly, the sound echoing unnaturally in the still air. Inside, the light came from a single lantern sitting on a rickety table. The room was small and bare, with a dirt floor and walls covered in strange symbols carved deep into the wood. And in the corner, huddled on the ground, was Luke. Ellie's breath caught. He looked thinner, his face pale and his eyes sunken. But it was him. He looked up at her, and the relief in his expression was so raw, so real, that it left no room for doubt. "Ellie, Sam," he rasped, his voice trembling. "Luke." Ellie rushed to him, dropping to her knees and wrapping her arms around him. He was cold, his body trembling like a leaf in the wind. Sam hovered near the door, his flashlight darting around the room. "What is this place? How long have you been here?" "Too long," Luke murmured, his voice barely audible. "It's hard to remember. Time doesn't work right here." Ellie pulled back to look at him. "We're getting you out of here, okay? You're coming home." Luke's eyes widened, and he shook his head weakly. "No, you can't. The bridge, it won't let us all leave." "What are you talking about?" Sam demanded, stepping closer. Luke's gaze flickered to the carvings on the walls. "The bridge takes one for everyone it gives back. It's the rule. If you want to leave, someone has to stay." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Ellie's heart pounded, her mind racing. She shook her head. "No, there's another way. There has to be." Luke reached out, his fingers curling weakly around her wrist. "Ellie, it's already too late. It won't let us go without a price." Sam's flashlight beam landed on a new set of symbols carved into the floor, fresh and glistening as if they'd been etched moments ago. He swallowed hard. "Ellie, we're not alone." The fog outside the cabin began to thicken, pressing against the windows like a living thing. The hum they'd heard on the bridge grew louder, resonating through the cabin walls. Ellie looked at Luke, her jaw clenched. "We're not leaving you behind. I don't care what it takes." But deep down she knew the bridge didn't care about promises. The hum outside rose to a low, resonating growl, vibrating the walls of the cabin. The flickering lantern dimmed, casting deep shadows that seemed to shift and stretch across the room. Ellie tightened her grip on Luke's cold hand, her pulse thundering in her ears. "Ellie." Sam's voice was shaky as his flashlight beam swept the walls, highlighting the strange carvings. "These symbols, they're moving." She glanced up and felt her stomach drop. The symbols carved into the wood seemed alive, writhing and twisting in ways that defied logic, as if they were trying to communicate or warn them. "Stop looking at them," Ellie snapped, dragging her eyes away. She pulled Luke to his feet, his weight sagging heavily against her. "We're leaving. Now." "No," Luke whispered, his voice trembling. "It won't let us." The growl outside deepened, turning into a guttural roar that reverberated in Ellie's chest. The fog outside pressed harder against the windows, the glass rattling under the strain. For a moment she thought it might shatter, letting whatever was out there pour inside. "We don't have a choice," Ellie said, her voice firm despite the panic clawing at her insides. She turned to Sam. "Help me." Sam hesitated, his face pale in the dim light. "Ellie, he said someone has to stay. What if—" "Don't." Her voice was sharp, cutting through the growing noise. "We're all getting out of here. No one stays behind." Sam nodded reluctantly and moved to Luke's other side, slinging his arm over his shoulder. Together, they half carried him toward the door. As Ellie reached for the handle, the room plunged into complete darkness. The lantern extinguished with a faint hiss, and the flashlight beams flickered wildly before sputtering out, leaving them blind in the suffocating black. Then came the voices. They weren't whispers. Ellie was thankful for that. But they were low, guttural, and inhuman. The words were incomprehensible, but the malice in them was unmistakable. The fog outside the cabin seemed to seep through the cracks in the walls, curling around their ankles like cold, wet hands. "Keep moving," Ellie urged, her voice barely audible over the rising cacophony. The door wouldn't budge. She yanked at the handle with all her strength, but it felt as if the wood itself had fused together. Behind her, the voices grew louder, overlapping into a chaotic, grating chorus. Something thudded against the walls, and she swore she could feel the cabin itself shuddering under the assault. "Ellie," Luke's voice was weak but urgent. "It's the mist. It's trying to keep us here." She turned to him, her eyes straining to see anything in the oppressive dark. "What does it want?" Luke's answer came slowly, painfully. "To take one of us. That's the rule." Ellie clenched her jaw. Then we'll break the damn rule. She groped blindly for something, anything that could help. Her fingers brushed against the table, and she grabbed the lantern, shaking it until the flame sputtered weakly back to life. The faint light illuminated the room just enough for her to see what had been hidden in the dark. Shapes. Dozens of them. They were pressed against the walls, humanoid figures made of swirling mist, their hollow eyes fixed on her. They were still, but the malevolence radiating from them was palpable, a physical force that pressed against her chest. "They're watching us," Sam whispered, his voice trembling. Ellie tightened her grip on the lantern. "Then let them watch. We're not staying." The mist figures didn't move, but the door groaned as if in response, the handle suddenly loosening under her hand. She shoved it open and the fog poured in, cold and relentless, as if trying to drag them back. But Ellie pushed through, pulling her brothers with her into the night. The fog was waiting for them outside, thick and suffocating. And somewhere within it, something was moving. The mist closed in around them the moment they stepped outside. Ellie tightened her grip on Luke, her free hand holding the lantern high. Its weak, flickering light was barely enough to push back the encroaching fog, which moved like a living thing, swirling and shifting in unnatural patterns. "Keep moving," Ellie urged, her voice firm despite the fear clawing at her chest. Sam, on Luke's other side, glanced nervously around. "It's too thick, we can't see a thing." "We don't need to see," Ellie snapped. "We just need to get away from that cabin." But the mist had other plans. Shapes began to form in the fog, indistinct at first but quickly solidifying. Figures loomed around them, their features obscured but their presence undeniable. They didn't move, didn't speak, but their sheer proximity made Ellie's skin crawl. "Ellie," Luke whispered, his voice weak. "They're the others." She glanced at him, her brow furrowing. "What others?" "The ones who didn't make it. They're trapped here, watching." The thought sent a chill through her, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. Her boots squelched against the damp ground as she pushed forward, her focus narrowing to the path directly ahead. But the path wasn't steady. It twisted and shifted underfoot, the forest seeming to rearrange itself around them. Trees appeared where there had been none, and familiar landmarks seemed to vanish into the mist. "It's messing with us," Sam muttered, his voice tight with frustration. "We're going in circles." "No," Ellie said through gritted teeth. "We're not. Just keep going." The shapes in the mist grew bolder, stepping closer. Ellie caught glimpses of their faces, pale, hollow-eyed, their mouths twisted in silent screams. One of them reached out as they passed, its hand disintegrating into tendrils of fog before it could make contact. Luke stumbled, nearly dragging them both down. "I can't," he gasped. "Yes, you can," Ellie said, her tone sharper than she intended. "We didn't come this far to lose you now." But the mist wasn't giving up. It coiled around them, pulling at their clothes, their limbs, like it was trying to drag them back. Ellie felt the air grow colder, the chill biting into her skin despite the layers she wore. And then she heard it again. Luke's voice. Not the weak, rasping voice of the brother leaning heavily on her shoulder, but a stronger, more vibrant version. It came from somewhere ahead, clear and confident. "Ellie, Sam, over here." Sam froze, his eyes wide. That's Luke." Ellie's stomach twisted. She didn't know what to believe anymore. "No, it's not him. It can't be." But the voice called again, insistent. "Hurry, this way." Sam hesitated, his grip on Luke loosening. "What if it is him? What if he's—" "It's not," Ellie snapped, her voice cutting through the fog. The real Luke stirred beside her, his head lolling weakly. Don't listen," he murmured, but Sam was already pulling away, stepping toward the voice. "Sam!" Ellie shouted, reaching for him. The fog thickened, swallowing him up before her fingers could grasp his jacket. "Sam!" Ellie screamed, panic surging through her as the mist closed in tighter, pressing against her like a suffocating weight. And then, as suddenly as it had taken him, the fog began to recede. The shapes dissolved, the air growing still. Ellie spun around, her heart pounding. Sam was gone, and so was the path. Ellie stood frozen, the lantern trembling in her hand as she stared into the fog. The space where Sam had been moments ago was now empty, the mist swirling as if mocking her. "Sam!" she screamed, her voice echoing into the void. There was no reply, only the oppressive silence that seemed to press harder against her chest. Beside her, Luke slumped to his knees, his weight too much for her to bear alone. He looked up at her, his pale face etched with fear and guilt. "I told you, it takes what it wants." Ellie dropped down beside him, gripping his shoulders tightly. "We're not losing him too. Do you hear me? We're getting out of here, all of us." Luke's eyes brimmed with tears, and for the first time Ellie saw how broken he truly was. "You don't understand. The bridge has rules. It doesn't care what you want. It doesn't care about fairness." Ellie shook him, her frustration boiling over. "Then we'll break the damn rules. You said it yourself. Someone has to stay. Fine. It's me. I'll stay." "No," Luke's voice cracked, the desperation in it cutting through the thick air. "It doesn't work like that. It chooses. You don't get to decide." Ellie's grip faltered, her heart pounding as the reality of his words sank in. "And what are we supposed to do?" Luke looked away, his gaze distant. "I don't know. I've tried everything. Bargaining, running, fighting. It always wins." Ellie refused to accept that. She pulled Luke to his feet, her jaw clenched. "Well, it hasn't met me yet." She turned back toward the swirling mist, her knuckles white around the lantern's handle. The glow barely cut through the darkness, but it was enough to show the faintest of trails, a path leading deeper into the unknown. "We're finding him," she said, her voice steady. Luke hesitated, his body trembling as he leaned on her for support. "Ellie, what if it's already taken him?" Her chest tightened, but she shook her head. "Then we'll take him back." They followed the faint path, the fog pressing close on all sides. The mist moved unnaturally, curling and twisting in ways that defied logic. Shapes flickered in and out of view, some human-like, others grotesquely alien. Ellie kept her focus forward, her grip on Luke tightening every time he stumbled. The hum that had plagued them since the bridge was growing louder, a low, resonating thrum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It vibrated in Ellie's skull, making it hard to think. "Ellie," Luke's voice was weak, barely audible over the sound. "It's close." She didn't need to ask what he meant. She could feel it too, a presence watching them, waiting. Ahead, the path widened into another clearing. In the center stood a massive stone arch, its surface carved with the same shifting symbols as the cabin walls. Beyond it, the fog swirled violently, like a storm waiting to break. And there, at the edge of the arch, was Sam. He stood motionless, his back to them, his flashlight dangling limply in his hand. "Sam," Ellie called, relief and fear flooding her in equal measure. She hurried forward, dragging Luke with her. But as she approached, something about Sam's stance made her slow. His shoulders were too stiff, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. "Sam?" she said again, her voice wavering. He turned slowly, and Ellie's blood ran cold. His face was blank, his eyes hollow. A faint smile twisted his lips, but it wasn't his. "It's not him," Luke whispered, his voice trembling. Ellie's grip on the lantern tightened as Sam, or whatever was pretending to be him, stepped closer. "Ellie," he said, his voice flat and lifeless. "It's okay. I found the way out." Ellie froze, her breath caught in her throat. The thing that looked like Sam stood a few feet away, its face eerily calm, its voice hollow. The flickering lantern light cast shadows across its features, exaggerating the wrongness of it all. "Ellie," it said again with a smile that didn't belong to her brother. "Come with me. I found the way." Her stomach twisted, her instincts screaming at her to run, but she held her ground. "You're not Sam," she said, her voice firm despite the tremor in it. The thing tilted its head, its smile widening. "Don't be silly, it's me, I'm fine. Just come through the arch. It's safe here." Luke clutched her arm, his grip weak but insistent. "It's lying," he rasped. "The bridge doesn't let you leave, not like this." Ellie didn't need the warning. She could feel the malice radiating from the thing wearing her brother's face. "Where is he?" she demanded, stepping forward. "What did you do to him?" The thing didn't answer. It simply pointed toward the swirling fog beyond the arch. "He's waiting. You can find him, but you have to come through. That's the rule." Ellie's pulse thundered in her ears. "What rule?" "You know the rule," it said, its voice soft and melodic, like a song played in reverse. "One for one, a soul to cross back. It's always been the way." Luke pulled at her arm again, his breathing labored. "Don't listen," he begged. "It's not him, it's the bridge." But Ellie wasn't listening. Her mind was racing, every instinct screaming at her to protect her brothers, to get them both out of this nightmare. She looked at the arch, then back at the creature wearing Sam's face. "I'll stay," she said, the words leaving her mouth before she could think them through. "Take me. Let them go." The thing blinked, its head cocking slightly. For the first time it seemed uncertain. "You can't decide," it said. "The bridge chooses." "Then let it choose," Ellie shouted, her voice cracking. "Just leave them alone." The thing smiled again, slow and deliberate. "You don't understand, do you? It already has." Before Ellie could react, the fog surged forward, swallowing the thing in an instant. The humming grew deafening, vibrating through her skull as the ground seemed to shift beneath her feet. "Ellie!" Luke's voice was distant, his grip slipping as the fog tore him away. The mist closed in, wrapping around her like a shroud. She tried to scream, but the sound was lost in the deafening roar. Images flashed in her mind, Sam's face, hollow and lifeless, Luke's desperate eyes, the bridge stretching endlessly into the void. And then silence. When the fog lifted, Ellie found herself standing alone in the clearing. The stone arch loomed before her, its symbols glowing faintly in the dim light. Beyond it, the path stretched into darkness. "Ellie?" She turned, her heart leaping. Sam stood a few feet away, Luke leaning heavily on him for support. Both of them looked shaken but alive. "You made it," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. But something was wrong. The air was heavy and the ground beneath her felt unsteady. She took a step toward them, but the path seemed to pull away, stretching into the distance. "Ellie," Sam's voice cracked, his face pale. "You're not—" The ground beneath her shifted, and suddenly she understood. She wasn't on the path anymore. She was standing on the bridge. Ellie froze, her breath catching as she looked down. The bridge beneath her feet was cold and slick, its surface gleaming in the pale light filtering through the mist. The carvings etched into the planks writhed, their meaning unknowable but deeply wrong. "Ellie," Sam called, his voice desperate. He and Luke stood on solid ground just beyond the arch, their forms distorted by the swirling fog. "What are you doing? Come on." "I can't," she said, her voice trembling. The realization hit her like a punch to the chest. "It's me. I'm the one who has to stay." "No!" Sam shouted, stepping toward the arch, but the mist recoiled violently, forcing him back. The space beyond the arch seemed to shimmer, a barrier forming between them. Ellie felt the weight of the bridge's choice settle over her like a suffocating blanket. "You can't do this!" Sam screamed, his voice cracking with panic. Luke leaned heavily against his brother, his face pale and stricken. "It's how it works," he murmured. "It's always been this way." Ellie's chest tightened, tears streaming down her face as she looked at her brothers. She'd spent months searching for Luke, holding their family together, refusing to give up. Now the thought of letting them go, of leaving them behind, was unbearable. But she knew there was no other way. "You have to go," she said, her voice firm despite the tears. "Both of you, you have to leave now, before it changes its mind." Sam shook his head violently. "No, I'm not leaving you here." "Sam," she said, her tone softening, "please look after Luke. Look after Mom and Dad. They need you." Her words hit him like a blow, and for a moment he was silent, his fists clenched at his sides. Then he took a shaky step forward, his voice breaking. "Ellie, please, we can figure something out. We can—" "There's no time," she interrupted, her gaze shifting to the mist that swirled hungrily around the bridge. It was closing in, waiting to claim her. She forced a smile, though it felt hollow. "You'll be okay, both of you, I promise." Sam looked like he wanted to argue, but Luke touched his arm, his expression resigned. "We have to go," Luke said quietly. Sam turned to him, disbelief and anguish written all over his face, but eventually he nodded. "Ellie?" Sam's voice cracked as he stepped back, pulling Luke with him. "I'm so sorry." She didn't reply. She couldn't. The fog thickened, swallowing the space between them. The last thing Ellie saw was Sam's tear-streaked face and Luke's hollow eyes before they disappeared into the mist. The bridge groaned beneath her, the sound reverberating like a final, echoing sigh. Ellie turned and looked out into the endless fog. She didn't know what awaited her, but she took a deep breath and stepped forward, her feet carrying her into the void. Sam and Luke emerged from the forest just as the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon. The air was crisp and clear, the oppressive fog gone as if it had never existed. They stood in silence, staring at the spot where the bridge should have been. The forest was quiet, peaceful, but to them, it felt hollow. "She saved us," Sam said finally, his voice barely a whisper. Luke nodded, tears streaming silently down his face. They walked back to their car in silence, the weight of their loss pressing down on them. Neither spoke as they drove home, leaving the cursed forest behind. But as they crossed the county line, Sam glanced in the rearview mirror. For a fleeting moment, he thought he saw a figure standing at the edge of the trees watching them. It was Ellie, and then she was gone. Hey guys, if you like my videos, please like and subscribe to my channel. I would really appreciate it. Thanks.